Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of Hudson's Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. I'm joined today by Air Chief Marshal Mike Wigston of the Royal Air Force, where he is the commander and head of the Royal Air Force, where he oversees 35,000 regular and reserve personnel, over 5,000 civil servants, and thousands of contractors. Air Chief Marshal Wigston was commissioned in 1986, completed his initial pilot training on the Tornado, followed by a succession of frontline tours, including operational deployments to Iraq and enforcing no-fly zones. He also commanded Bomber Squadron 12, leading squadron in 2 operational tours, as well as multiple international exercises. He served in operational headquarters as well at the Combined Combat Operations Center at the Combined Air and Space Operations Center, or the CAOC, in Qatar, that is run by the United States and its allies, and also as the commander of the air operations in the ISAF Joint Command in Afghanistan, for which he was awarded the Commander of the British Empire. His staff appointments have included in the Ministry of Defense, the Operations Directorate, as well as being the administrator responsible for civil governance of the British forces that are based in Cyprus. And prior to becoming chief of the air staff, he was deputy commander of capability, which meant that he oversees all of the capability development for the Royal Air Force, including people, equipment, infrastructure, and training. He read engineering science at Oriel College at Oxford. He also attended the Advanced Command and Staff course. He has a Master's of Arts in Defense Studies from King's College and attended the Higher Command and Staff course, as well as the UK Pinnacle course. So very impressive resume, and we're very happy to have you here with us today, Air Chief Marshal Wigston. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Bryan, and I'm delighted to be here.
Recently, the United Kingdom government, the Ministry of Defense, put out the new integrated review, Global Britain in a Competitive Age, as well as the Defense Command paper that goes along with it, which is Defense in a Competitive Age. There's a theme there. Both papers reinforce this idea that the British military is going to be forward and engaged, increasing the amount of its operations abroad as a way to shape the environment, as well as deter and dissuade aggression. How well prepared is the Royal Air Force to contribute to that effort when you consider the challenges of maintaining readiness at a higher operational tempo, while also developing the next generation of capabilities that the Royal Air Force will need to deploy?
Well, Bryan, thank you for the introduction and a great opening question. The integrated review, as we called it, as you say, was a great opportunity to reassess the United Kingdom's place in the world and to assess what that world looks like and what we think it will look like into the future. And the conclusions of the review set out a world which is more unstable, it is uncertain, complex, and dynamic, and the sort of defining condition of our times is chronic instability. And if you lace in that with the threats that we think we will face, whether that is an increasingly aggressive, reckless, adventurous Russia, that we are clear-eyed about what Chinese expansionism means, what the toxic ideology underpinning violent extremism means for continued acts of terror around the world, and then interlaced with what technology brings in terms of the sophistication of the threat systems we face and the proliferation of them. That is quite a sobering picture of the world that we see in the future, and the review and the strategic review was very clear in how it sensed that and portrayed that. But it was also very clear in terms of how it saw the UK's place in that world as a burden-sharing, problem-solving nation, active on the world stage, but a nation that recognized that we depend on an open and resilient international system for our security and our prosperity. And for me, as the chief of the air staff, as the head of the UK Royal Air Force, what I felt was a really important element of that review and the conclusions of the review was our government's clear statement of the importance of the United Kingdom armed forces in that and that role in securing our security and our prosperity, and then investing in the UK armed forces with an additional equivalent of $33 billion over the next 4 years on top of what we were going to get. So an increase in spending. So as an air chief, as an armed forces chief, we have a very clear mandate about the UK's place in the world as a global actor, and the role of the armed forces in that, and the part that the Royal Air Force will play in that. Throughout the review, and getting to the second part of your question, throughout the review, I was able to demonstrate the utility of air and space power, because air and space power over the last 3 decades, but over the last year, has time and time again given our government in the UK the opportunity and the ability to act on a world stage, to act at speed, at range, precisely, and with minimal political risk and maximum political choice. We are a critical, a critical enabler of activity in the land and maritime domains, but we are a critical effect of itself. So air and space power was, the utility of it was recognised throughout the review.
Which completely makes sense given the speed and the reach of operations that are needed today. We're moving into a world where a lot of actors that we had previously considered to be middle powers have the ability to reach out at the kind of ranges with precision that we'd only associated with great powers during the Cold War. So it certainly makes sense that air and space power are going to be prominent there. As we embark on this new strategic direction, though, the Royal Air Force is very busy still in the Middle East with the combined Tornado Squadron down in Qatar, with continued operations in the region in Afghanistan, or rather Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So is there going to need to be a pivot to spend more time focused on the European theater, or are we going to have to try to do more with more, I guess, if you're getting more resources? How do you balance the efforts that are ongoing in the Middle East with the new efforts that need to be undertaken to deal with resurgent China and Russia?
Well done, Brian, because you got to the crux of the issue, and the challenge for me as a chief now is to live up to the mandate that our government has given us, and that question about where we deploy our forces and how we use our forces is absolutely what we are working through at the moment. The review concluded that for the UK Armed Forces, of a much more persistent global engagement, working with our allies, deepening our partnerships and relationships around the world was a key part of how we will compete against potential adversaries below the threshold. We talked a lot about the grey zone, hybrid warfare, and competing below the zone, because for us that there are people out there who recognise that the United Kingdom, the United States, like-minded allies, we have moral, legal, ethical thresholds of response below the level of conflict, and our potential adversaries exploit those thresholds where they and that's something that we've got to be much more alive to and be ready to compete and contest that grey zone space. So being engaged around the world is important for the Royal Air Force, it's important for the British Army and for the Royal Navy. But first and foremost, to my mind, our role is to be at the vanguard of European security and NATO. And that is, and as I speak, we've just deployed a Typhoon squadron down to Romania to take part in NATO air policing in the Black Sea. NATO is our most important military alliance. It's the most successful military alliance the world has ever seen, and we are absolutely invested in continuing to contribute to that. But you talked about the Middle East, you talked about our role in the Indo-Pacific, and I think the new, again, the integrated review recognised that for the United Kingdom, the Indo-Pacific mattered. For the United Kingdom, as a country that relies on an open and resilient international system, so much is at stake around our economies, around our the biodiversity and the climate. Much of that is reliant on an open and resilient Indo-Pacific region, and so we have a part to play in working with our allies to give them the support they need to keep that open and resilient system.
So it's interesting you raised the gray zone. So I'll ask a little bit about that. So one of the challenges that the U.S. has found with the gray zone operations of Russia and China to a lesser degree is they're able to combine those operations with long-range sensor and precision weapons networks. So if you think about Kaliningrad, the Western Military District of Russia, they've got precision weapons that can range a lot of Eastern Europe from Russian territory. And that provides essentially an overwatch or umbrella for the gray zone activities that might happen underneath. So if we want to intervene, we're doing so with the knowledge that we could be attacked and counterattacked with a large number of precision weapons. It also gives them this air defense umbrella that can protect their gray zone activities in places like the Donbass in Ukraine from kind of aerial bombardment from Allied forces or Ukrainian forces. So how is the Royal Air Force thinking about how to deal with the Russian anti-access challenge, particularly in the context of the gray zone, where it's really just sort of this threat in being that's providing the escalation advantage to their gray zone forces?
Yeah, Bryan, again, a great question and a really important one. In the first instance, I'll say the very fact that we recognise that there is sort of grey zone, if I can call it that, grey zone activity going on below the zone of conflict, and that we're positioning ourselves to compete against that and to confront it, and to recognise that our adversary, Russia, is exploiting our threshold of response, and we need to be much clearer in the deterrence messaging that we're providing, but also both being able to detect and respond to that activity below the zone. So without sort of separating it in your question, I would say that that's almost a strand of activity of itself that we've got to be, and like-minded allies like the United States, this is something that we have just got to get more sophisticated in and more coordinated and working with allies, because as allies we will be and working as allies, working together, the whole will be much greater than the sum of the parts in this sort of regime. But I think actually the fundamental and the most important part of your question, if I may, turning to it, is the recognition that, as I said a few minutes ago, with the sophistication, the technological sophistication of the threats that we face and their proliferation, and the recognition that the air superiority that we have enjoyed for the last 3 decades is now challenged. And our ability to operate in airspace in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Syria, in parts of Eastern Europe, in other parts of the world, is now challenged in a way that it hasn't been for many decades. And that's what's driving the analysis and the development of programs and future air systems that is able to operate and contest and defeat those systems. So this, if you like, is the fundamental takeaway for me in terms of future equipment programs from the integrated review and the analysis that we've done this year, is that we can't rest on our laurels and celebrate the utility of air power and everything that air power, the speed, range, precision that I talked about previously, and pretend that and take it for granted that we'll continue to be able to operate like that, because even now we're seeing our freedom of operation is being challenged. And so we've got to be ready to confront that technologically. We've got to find ways of deterring the malign behavior that we're seeing. I think it's a topic for a whole new think tank discussion, but we've got to rethink the concept of deterrence and make sure that we've got deterrence fit for the 21st century. And tied in all of that is how we're going to work with in a contested anti-access denial environment when we're up against some very sophisticated threat systems, and there's lots of them.
Right, and so that makes me think about the U.S. and the allies are now going to leave Afghanistan later this year. And General McKenzie, the current commander of U.S. forces there, noted that at this point we don't really have air superiority in some places in the Middle East. So it does go to your point that essentially having the ability to deal with contested environments is the table stakes anymore. We don't have this ability to think of the Middle East as this permissive environment, and then other places as being these different environments. It's almost like we need to have a better kit no matter which area you're in, because the proliferation of these air defense threats is such that everybody's got them.
Yeah, and that's that's the world we operate in now, and it's something that is not going to go away, and it's it's probably going to get worse as these systems proliferate. That's what technology allows. So there's a significant amount of investment, intellectual and cash terms, into the future systems that we're going to be operating later this decade and into the 2030s.
You brought up a very interesting point about deterrence, and one of the areas I wanted to ask you about was we're seeing this gray zone warfare, and some of the other activities we're seeing suggest that warfare is the character of warfare is changing to focus on decision making and information as being the primary battlefields, more so than attrition being the source of victory. So with the advent of decision making being kind of the central competition in warfare, do you see there's going to be a new need for different space and C4ISR capabilities to enable this new kind of information-centric form of warfare? China talks about this, obviously, and has talked about it for a while in their doctrine, but we're seeing now that it's being put into practice through their gray zone operations, and also some of the efforts that the Allies have taken on with command and control suggest decision-making is really the new battlefield of the future.
Yeah, so Brian, a great question, and there's no doubt that when you look at the direction that technology is moving in, our ability to understand a situation, to decide what action needs to be taken, to decide how best to take that action, what's the best system to employ, to then and then to execute that decision, to do it faster than our adversaries, when our adversaries might be throwing something at us at 6 times the speed of sound. Suddenly the role of data and information in our future battle space becomes starkly apparent. And so for me, the digital connectivity and a future where every sensor on every operator or platform in the battle space is able to feed data and to be able to to draw on the information and in large part make decisions autonomously by machines. That gets to the crux of where we've got to go. There was a sort of more philosophical element to your question about the sort of the nature and character of warfare, and that in essence that information war where we are ultimately, it's about influencing populations and influencing their leaders. Yes, of course, there are different platforms and different ways of doing it, but I'm going to, as I say, I take a whilst I absolutely sort of recognize that challenge, for me there is the challenge is about connectivity and moving data that is information that is usable, and making the right decisions faster than our adversary.
Right. Yeah, and I was thinking of it mostly in that military context, of the information competition and the decision-making competition in the military setting. So essentially the OODA loop.
Yeah, but there was something else you sort of said, I think, in the question. I may have sort of misheard or misremembered, but it's something that I'm very sort of keen to sort of to talk about as well at the moment, because actually throughout our lives, our generation, that trade-off between technology and mass has been the story of our lives. My predecessors introduced ever more technologically superior platforms, but you almost sort of divided by a factor of 10 how many you could afford, and so you got some very effective weapon systems and aircraft, but you didn't have very many of them. Well, I think here we are in 2021, and I think technology allows us to turn a corner, And I would offer, I would say that whereas previously it was a hard choice between technology and mass, well, I think technology now allows us to have both. And that's the things that we're looking at around loyal wingmen, so uncrewed but formating combat aircraft, where future formations might be an entirely different mix, but where technology allows us to mass produce and to a degree have an element of them being expendable as well. And for me, for the future, I think that mass technology line, I wonder if in the future people will look back and say, actually, yeah, they turned a corner in 2020.
Right. That's a great point. And that's what I was trying to get at, is this the idea of attrition-centric warfare, which you could argue, World War II, parts of the Cold War we really thought of as being an attrition-centric fight. And then we transitioned to much more about decision-making, maybe in the post-Cold War period. And now we're at a point where maybe we're able to accommodate both. Maybe there's a role for attrition and a role for decision-making being dominant in terms of the theory of victory.
Yeah, and the theory of deterrence as well.
Right.
And and I think that it's a really interesting time, and these are, and then when you bring into the mix, process automation, machine learning, and ultimately high-end AI into that mix as well. It's a fascinating time.
Yeah, very much so. And so with regards to decision-making competition, that was something I was going to ask about, is it the Royal Air Force is investing in the kind of decision support capabilities that will allow that field commander who's cut off, from maybe the rest of the higher headquarters to be able to make decisions about how to best employ his or her combination of loyal wingmen and airplanes and space capabilities. Is that something you're pursuing?
Yes, we are. And I'm an impatient chief in that regard, because I, like many of my counterparts, and I know CQ Brown, the CSAF, is in exactly the same place. I've grown tired of looking at PowerPoint slides with lightning bolt symbols, joining up bits of kit, and us talking about it a lot, recognizing it's important, but not actually making any meaningful progress, and certainly not operationalizing it. So what I've done is I've sort of become a very demanding, very impatient chief, and said, I want to see this fielded operationally in my time. And so we are aiming for a fielding of a system that we've been developing in the labs for a couple of years. But effectively, it's to some extent it's off the shelf, but it's a very it's a system, a combat cloud with enormous utility. And for air platforms and maritime platforms, and I'm going to do an operational trial, I hope, in the North Atlantic, in the anti-submarine role in 2022. That's bringing to life that ability to move information and move data and fuse information, so that any operator, any platform in the battle space can pull on the information it needs, fuse it with what it knows in its immediate environment, and enable it to make better decisions than an adversary.
And I think a lot of people, when you talk about combat cloud and that idea of bringing information from all the players and fusing it, they think of like net-centric warfare, where this is all being managed out of the CAOC, with some 3-star commander. And what you're describing is very much something that's happening out at the edge. With whatever forces can communicate with each other. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Brian, you're absolutely spot on. We won't have the luxury of time in the future. This will be, this has to be something that happens in milliseconds, the speed of light, and we're going to rely on people, platforms out there in the battle space to have the information they need to make the decisions. But technology allows those decisions to be, the actual the decision points to be automated as well, and it's the role of the human in that loop, which again is another piece of philosophical work that we need to get our heads around, and particularly when it comes to lethal kill chains.
Yeah, this idea of human command and machine control essentially is going to be a really important one to work through. And in some of the projects we've done with DARPA, the hard thing is figuring out how the human interacts with the machine. How do they interact with that decision support system?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the I think that's the challenge. Over the next 20 years, that's the challenge. It's how we for the human who for the foreseeable future is going to be in the loop somewhere.
Yeah.
How do we get that information into that human? And I'm not talking about cranial implants, but that we might be there one day.
Right. Yeah, but having the ability for the commander to do what you would do with a human subordinate who you've had the same training as, so you can have this mind meld. But to do that with a machine where you've got to actually type in, what are the constraints, what's the ROE, what are your expectations? That's the hard part, I think.
Yeah. And again, I think one of the challenges for us in the UK and the United States will be that we will have legal and moral and ethical thresholds.
Right.
That our adversaries won't necessarily.
Right.
So it won't be a level playing field, and we've just got to be alive to all of the challenges in that. But that for me is clearly the way that technology is going.
Yeah. You raised anti-submarine warfare, which I thought was an interesting mission area I wanted to ask you about. Is the Royal Air Force? This is a long-standing mission for the Royal Air Force. I think people will think this is a Navy mission, but in the UK, this has been a Royal Air Force mission for all along. Are you looking at the employment of more unmanned systems for ASW? Because as a submariner, I'll tell you one of the biggest challenges for the people that were hunting us was manned aircraft. Have only a certain amount of time they can be in the air. There's a relatively small number of them. It's hard to scale. If you get a significant submarine threat or a persistent submarine threat. Are you looking at how to use unmanned systems as part of the team that's doing ASW?
Yes, and the system that we're absolutely going to be exploring the potential of is the MQ-9B, which comes into service in 2023. So we're going to call it the Protector in Royal Air Force service, but a maritime role for that. Both in an anti-surface, but equally as a force multiplier in the ASW role will be something that we will absolutely be exploring, because as we go from the sort of Reaper to Protector, it's just it's a scale up in payload and range and endurance, and that ability to sort of sit overhead for days as a relay and as a force multiplier, for me has huge advantage given the very fast changing landscape below the surface of the Atlantic at the moment. The challenge is there, and the challenge that we face from the Russian Navy and the challenge to our global connectivity. And our operations in the Atlantic. So this really matters. It matters to NATO, and it certainly matters to the UK and the United States. Right.
Yeah, definitely. One of the challenges with the ASW kill chain, if you will, is closing it. So finding a submarine can be done. Tracking it is harder, but still could be done with the unmanned sensors, with SOSUS, with some other capabilities like that. It's always that, how do I actually take out the submarine? We're kind of gotten to the point where submarines, the great power submarines, are good enough to where you really have to get a heavyweight torpedo on them to guarantee that you're going to kill them. But there's other approaches, that have worked in the past that basically just suppress the submarine, because you drop weapons on it, it drives away, or it drives away fast enough you can track it better and get a better solution on it. Are you looking at new approaches, or new concepts, or new metrics for ASW when you start thinking about unmanned systems being employed to be able to close that kill chain, and looking at suppression versus killing submarines as an option?
So I'd say yes, and we are recruiting, Brian, because it sounds to me like there's a job for you in my headquarters. But I won't go into the details here. But the finish, the kill, that part of the operational chain is something that we're investing a lot of analysis, and in due course the equipment that we will field to ensure that. So it's something that we're absolutely working on, Brian. So if you've got a spare moment, we'll you can send your resume in.
I'd be happy to. So another capability area that you're investing in substantially is the next generation of aircraft. So the Tornado is a long-standing aircraft, obviously, in the UK. The F-35B is entering service. There's options for potentially other European derivative aircraft. Where do you see the portfolio of essentially fighter attack aircraft going in the Royal Air Force? And then how are you going to balance that investment against the C4ISR aircraft that you've been investing in that are very capable?
Sure. So, I think you mentioned Tornado. I think you meant to say Typhoon. So
I meant Typhoon.
Yes, that's right. We retired Tornado a couple of years ago. But my force for the next 20 years or so is a mix of Typhoon and F-35, and I'm growing the F-35 force right now. We've taken delivery of 21 aircraft. We'll go up to 33 next year and 48 the year after that, and we will continue to grow the force because going back to naval and air force roles, one of the remarkable things that the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy are doing this year is that we're going to launch our first operational deployment of the Royal Navy's new aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, this year. With a Royal Air Force squadron of F-35s on board, alongside a US Marine Corps squadron of F-35Bs, and this is Royal Air Force squadrons providing maritime air power for the Royal Navy, and it's working remarkably well. There are people out there who have said it couldn't possibly happen, and the First Sea Lord, the head of the Royal Navy, and I are just delighted with the way our teams have come together and the way that the HMS Queen Elizabeth's deployment through the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific Ocean, will absolutely establish what the UK is talking about when it talks about being a globally engaged nation again. So the continued growth of the F-35 is a really important element of what I'm talking about. We've got 2 carriers. I need at least 3 squadrons, probably 4 squadrons of F-35Bs before I can even pause for breath. So we are going to be growing that force for many years to come, and I'm going to be operating it for many years to come, because the Queen Elizabeth class was built for F-35Bs, and the Queen Elizabeth class is going to be in service till the late 2060s. So my fleet of F-35Bs, I've got to sustain it for another 50 years. So I'm in no hurry to start thrashing those airframes now, when my successor will not thank me for that in 40 years' time. The other element is Typhoon. Now, Typhoon is the backbone of the Royal Air Force's air defence and control of the Air Force, and that will be in service until, let's say, 2040, the early 2040s. So right now, I need to get going and working through what will replace the Typhoon in my quick reaction alert sheds from 2040. The clock is ticking. It's 19 years and to go, and you'll recognise that is a short timescale to introduce a modern combat aircraft into service, and that's what the integrated review announcement. That's why it's so welcome to me, because our government chose to invest $2.8 billion over the next 4 years to develop a demonstrator to work through what that concept will be for the future combat air system, such that we're in a position in about 4 years' time to make the big decision around the design and the build, so that by the late 2030s, I've got something that's lining up ready to replace Typhoon. But the thing about the future combat air system for me is that it won't just be replacing a piloted fighter like Typhoon with another latest generation piloted fighter. Actually, it'll be a game-changing mix of piloted and unpiloted, uncrewed combat aircraft and swarms of expendable drones that will be operating in an entirely different way to how we operate today, and we'll have as fundamental and will be as fundamental a change in the future battle space was as the as the advent of the jet age was. So doing the analysis to work out what that mix needs to be, how we will achieve the levels of autonomy, how we will achieve the levels of the command and control that's required between those parts with a minimum number of humans involved. Well, that's the challenge of the next few years, and then, as I say, big decisions in about 5 years, 4 years time. But what's interesting to me is that the United States Air Force is going through exactly the same process with NGAD, and so the opportunities to test each other's analysis is there, and as is happening in France and Germany, and with a European program. So there's lots of opportunity to feed off each other, to test each other, and frankly, Brian, a bit of competition's no bad thing.
It doesn't hurt. So one of the challenges, I think, in the near term, or the near to midterm, until the future combat air system begins to emerge, is going to be dealing with the anti-access environments that Russia and China create, but particularly with Russia, and the Typhoon, its ability to operate in those kinds of environments. So are you thinking about the Typhoon starting to operate with unmanned systems increasingly before you get to the future combat air system? Or are you looking at using standoff weapons, or are you going to bring the F-35 into the mix?
Yes, so the answer is absolutely yes, because where I have sort of set the challenge for my team is that when we're talking about loyal wingmen, uncrewed combat aircraft, I don't want to wait for Tempest in the late 2030s to field those. I want to field them this decade, to put on the wing of Typhoon, to put on the wing of the F-35. And in the same, for exactly the same reason, I've already established a trials squadron for our swarming drone platform, which we are operating and is already exceeding expectations in terms of what we're seeing in the way we're able to utilize that. So it's all coming together. But the challenge I've set, the gauntlet I've sort of laid down for my team, is that I want to see an operationally fielded loyal wingman flying on the wing of Typhoon before the end of this decade.
Well, that's terrific. I mean, because that's the kind of thing that's going to be necessary to deal with the highly contested environments we're likely to find in Eastern Europe or in the Western Pacific. And to get back to the deterrence discussion, if part of what we're going to do for deterrence is to try to affect the enemy's decision making and affect their confidence regarding their likelihood of success, it seems like things like loyal wingmen will be a key part of that. Yeah,
and also we shouldn't lose sight of what a game-changing platform the F-35 is. I mean, it is truly remarkable what it is capable of doing, and you talk about the anti-access area denial challenge, but I would throw straight back at you what F-35 is and what it can do. And as I look around NATO, as I look around the world, as more air forces become F-35 operators, as the mass of the F-35 enterprise grows, and these are our allies, and these are people who are coalition allies in NATO. Our ability to work with them, and coupled with the technological capability of the F-35 for all of its low observable qualities, the sensors, we have an absolute highly effective weapon system there. So it's not I'm not sitting here waiting for a loyal wingman to come along so that we can operate again. F-35 is that platform today.
Right, and you would see employing that in the European theater as well as in the Pacific, or on the carriers.
Yes.
Which the Pacific deployment, I thought brought up one other interesting point is you'll be deploying there as part of this kind of worldwide deployment. There's a lot of allies of the United States that are allies of each other that are going to be using F-35 as well. And there's also the 5 Defense Powers Agreement that creates that relationship with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand with the UK. Do you see the emergence of carrier-based aviation, the ability of the British military to project power into the Western Pacific as being a way to really invigorate those alliance and other relationships?
Yes, yes, I absolutely think it is. I think it's a clear demonstration that the United Kingdom is invested in that part of the world. It's a clear demonstration that the international rules and norms of behavior, the freedoms that we enjoy around marine navigation, air navigation, space, those are things that we're prepared to stand by our allies to ensure that those freedoms are resilient, are not subject to pressures or diminished in any way by countries like China, and to reassure our allies in the region that they have a choice, and that choice is to be sort of bullied by bigger neighbours, or to look to allies around the world to help secure an open and resilient international order.
Do you see do you think that you will, in the course of this deployment and the fact that the carriers will be out there, do you see Britain being more involved in the Indian Ocean? Obviously, you have a territory in Diego Garcia. There's interest, obviously, throughout the Indian Ocean region. The Chinese government has made a particularly aggressive play for countries in East Africa with which Britain has had some historical relationships. Do you see Britain and the military being more active in the Indian Ocean now that we've got two carriers that are able to deploy?
Yes, I think in the simple answer is yes, and of course Indian Ocean. I would, there's really important allies like India, working with the Indian Navy will be one of the objectives of the carrier deployment later this year. So I think the Indian Ocean, the Western Pacific, all of these will be countries where the UK will have a more persistent presence, that will be more forward deployed, and we'll be working with our allies in a way that we haven't done in recent years.
We're at the end of our time, I think. So Air Chief Marshal Mike Wigston, thank you very much for being with us today at Hudson Institute. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and it sounds like you're starting a fascinating period as the Air Chief with the advent of this new integrated review and the additional funding that's going to come with it. So congratulations on the work, and thank you very much for being here.
Well, Bryan, thank you very much for the conversation. It's wonderful to have been able to actually visit Washington to meet my counterparts, CSAF and CSO, and the USAF and the United States Space Force, and just to remind us of just how close we are as allies, how closely we work together around the world, our common viewpoint on the world, and the sort of the rich legacy of decades and decades of working together, which we can build on for the future. So it's been a fantastic opportunity, and I'm delighted to be back in Washington, and I hope as life returns to more normal for all of us, that these opportunities continue. So thank you very much, Bryan.
Thank you, and I agree. I'm looking forward to being able to get back to Britain and engage with our partner think tanks out there. So thank you again, and it's been great having you.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan.